Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's discussion. I'm delighted to welcome and to host a discussion with Nikos Konstantaras, a well-known contributor to Kathimerini, someone I'm sure who has a name that you recognize and the writings you've read very regularly. This is a larger audience than normal, so clearly your name has attracted a good audience this evening. I'm tempted to say that Nikos needs no introduction, but when people say that, they then proceed to introduce him. So let me introduce him. Nikos, as I say, is a columnist for the Kathimerini newspaper, a contributing columnist for the New York Times International Edition. He's the founding editor of Kathimerini's English edition. He was managing editor of the Greek edition of the newspaper from 2004 to 2017. He grew up in South Africa, and I guess you came to Greece when, Nico?
I was 22 in 1983, the golden age of PASOK.
Being politically interested, we define years by the party in power. So this evening we've invited Nikos to reflect on changes in Greek politics and to speak, of course, of this year's elections, and to look forward also to questions of reform in Greece, what the prospects might be for change in Greek politics and the Greek economy. So we're going to have a discussion which will try to cover a number of topics, but we will finish perhaps in 30 minutes or so, in order that we can invite you to make comments and questions, and we can proceed on that basis. So there's a kind of quick retrospective, Nico, if I may, and if I could simply begin with the question of in 2019, the election at the beginning of the summer, why you think Syriza and Alexis Tsipras lost the election?
Yes. First, let me say thank you very much for the invitation. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Kevin, and your staff for having me.
You're very welcome.
Before the election, and even before the May European Parliament elections, it was clear that Syriza was going to lose the election. I think it was clear to everybody except for Syriza. Even there, though, inside the party, you could see that they had run out of steam. There wasn't anything coming out. There were no ideas. There was no sense of a future in what was happening. It was more like we're dealing with issues. We got out of the bailout agreement. We completed it previous August, and that should be enough. We solved the Macedonia issue. People outside like us. People inside should like us. And that they felt was probably enough. They were also insulated in the bubble around the Prime Minister's office, where they didn't believe the polls that were showing that they were going to lose. I think that they got caught up in their own narrative that they were on the right side of history and that they would be judged positively for that.
But they could claim some economic progress since 2015. They could claim that things had stabilized and the third bailout had been completed, etc. So I guess it's easy for us to look back with hindsight that it was inevitable they were going to lose. But I wonder whether they were so delusional. Weren't there reasons for them to feel that actually they had made progress with the country?
Well, they had made progress, and we have to acknowledge that. And I think that the current government is fortunate that it is following Syriza's time in power for good reasons and for bad reasons, and we can go into them in greater detail. But the previous government does have a step up because of this. But to get back to why they lost,
Mm.
apart from this running out of steam and not having something to offer at that time, they did let down people very much, to a great extent. Now, they didn't lose so much. Getting 31%
Indeed.
is not a huge loss, and that is a sign of, I believe, and I sensed it from the beginning, from the election, and I still believe it, is that the people wanted stability. They didn't want to give anybody a free hand completely in politics. So they did vote for New Democracy, but they didn't wipe out Syriza. So you have a strong opposition there. There was the sense of that they let people down in many ways. One of them is that they did not reform Greece. That is the one thing, and we'll get into a lot of dichotomies tonight, because the other thing is that they let down the pensioners.
Yes.
People's pensions were reduced during their time. They can blame it on the memorandum, and they can blame it on foreigners and so on, but they did reduce people's pensions. And this is something that is always the big factor in politics, and is a factor that this government will have to deal with as well. So there was that sense of letting people down.
Okay.
They didn't reform. There was a lot of this bad image of what happened at the Mati fires, which were mishandled both during the fire and afterwards in the handling of the story. There was the image of Tsipras on holiday on a yacht and so on. All of these things, they chip away at the image that people think that they've cultivated. Others might be seeing it differently.
Yes.
So there was that, but I'll get back to the thing that pensions were the big issue and remain that, and you saw that New Democracy's biggest block was the pensioners, and nearly 1 in 2 pensioners voted for New Democracy.
If we come to New Democracy in a moment, I just wanted to get your views on what might happen with Syriza in the short and medium term. I think yesterday or today you published an op-ed in Kathimerini, which was talking essentially about whether Syriza would try to go back to the streets and join the protests. Syriza of the kind from before 2015, etc. As you mentioned, they've been seemingly supporting the protests within the universities. They were participating in the commemoration of the Polytechnic uprising on Sunday, etc. I guess we've long wondered what would come of Syriza in opposition after such a long period in government. It's a party or a movement with many different factions. It's found unity before coming to power challenging. I wonder whether you think the party is about to go under some significant change, transformation. You quite rightly, I think, identified this tension within the party in the last weeks or months about self-identity. Should we be there with the protesters in the streets, or are we a party that can somehow be occupying the full space of the centre-left? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this phrase about possibly emulating PASOK from the first term, etc. So, given the tensions, given the different scenarios, how would you see Syriza going forward?
I wish I could see how Syriza plans to go forward. Right now it's planning to go forward by going back. And it's going back into the very comfortable zone of being an opposition party that is stridently negative towards anything that the government does, which is the default position for Greek opposition parties, and it's not something to be surprised by. What I find surprising is that Syriza should know that it's in a position to take over a lot of political territory if it plays its hand well. PASOK, or what's left of PASOK, the 8% that Movement for Change, Kinal, got in the election, shows that that is not the leading force in the centre and centre-left right now, which suggests that Syriza could really move in that direction, but it is choosing to go in the direction not of the 40 or 30% or whatever it it has and could have, but towards the 3% that it had in the past. This, even the government noted this. It's not a secret in the political scene right now. What I find interesting, though, is that Syriza doesn't seem to understand that going back to that 3% core, it doesn't really go back to the 3%. A lot of that 3% is left. Syriza was in government and has been tainted by having been in government, and was always worried about the movements that were to its left. And I don't think it's going to get them back by trying to control the narrative in the streets anymore. So I think it's just doing what it's comfortable with doing without being able to really work out what will happen next.
So I wonder then, to those towards the centre, on its more moderate side of the spectrum, the immediate centre-left, you've mentioned about the movement for change, Kinal. Potami seems to be rather like a Monty Python dead parrot, as it were. Isn't it then rather peculiar that I wonder what will fill that vacuum if Syriza is looking in the mirror and thinking that we wish to be the radical party of all, then does that leave a space that someone else can fill on the more moderate left?
We've had a problem with leadership all this time. I think many countries have that same problem. I'd be very happy to see an exception. I think that if somebody comes out who can speak well and connect various dots in the political scene and in people's needs for change and stability, the two have to go together in some way, you might see something happening in the centre-left. Tsipras could have done that. I'm not ruling it out. We have the Congress. That will have to happen sometime soon. We don't have a date for it yet. And there they'll have to iron out these things. There are a lot of good people in Syriza and a lot of people with common sense and are practical. And if they have a say and they can push in that direction, maybe Syriza won't find itself out on a limb.
If it was a movement on the centre-left with a new leader, etc., then the question, I suppose, would be from where that leader might come from, in the sense that association with Kinal, with PASOK, with Potami, none of the leaders seem to have a particular public persona which is especially popular. So there's a question of recruiting a new politician that could unite the centre-left. If I remember correctly, just a few years ago, there were people like Nikos Alivizatos, who tried to instigate some change. I guess Greece may be a culture in which an academic might enter politics, but unlike other countries, perhaps we wouldn't expect a business person to enter politics. I'm just wondering what the scope might be for finding a new leader of the centre-left, given that the old parties that are failing don't seem to have a solution. Where would you find another leader from? It seems to be something of a vacant space for the medium term at least.
Well, I think it always is that. There's always a vacuum. There's always a need for a leader. And when we've seen strong leaders in Greece, speak about Greece, do not go further, they've sort of come out of circumstance and good fortune. And I'll go back to perhaps the greatest one of the modern era, which is Eleftherios Venizelos. I think that if Greece had not been in such a dead end at the time, there was no prospect of anything going right in Greece. And at the same time, there was this man who had gained huge credibility, both domestically and internationally, through his struggle for the for Crete to join Greece, so that the political elite of Greece at that time invited him to come and take over, probably expecting him to be a puppet in their hands, and then he had the credibility to take control.
Mm.
That was the biggest revolution, I would say, in politics. I think the Karamanlis, the elder, also had credibility by standing up to the establishment
Yes.
and becoming a power there. Sumeet, who was the other of the reformers in this line, it's very interesting that he became a reformer because he took charge of a party that was very powerful, very dominant, but not at all in favor of the reform that he was in favor of.
Mm.
But being this rational person in the head of this irrational army, he managed to get a lot of things done.
Mm.
So that again was, in my mind, a piece of good fortune, which doesn't guarantee that it will happen again very soon. But it's very depressing to say this, but I can't see anything happening positively without someone like that, and I have absolutely no one in mind, not even remotely, who could speak in a way that touches people, that people can relate to, and that people can trust. Because the problem in Greece has always been the lack of trust, the lack of faith in the process, and the lack of faith in each other, basically.
So, now turning to New Democracy and the new governments, does this mean really that it was Syriza that lost the election rather than New Democracy actually winning the election?
The two go together, because Syriza did New Democracy and especially its leader Kyriakos Mitsotakis a huge favor by campaigning the way they campaigned.
Mm.
So they not only lost the election, but they strengthened Mitsotakis in New Democracy. They underestimated their own weaknesses, they underestimated the New Democracy's cohesion, and they definitely underestimated New Democracy's leader. They made the whole election about him. They tried to present him as being extreme right-wing, as being the representative of this nepotistic system that is governed and so on. And when the people did not vote in the direction that Syriza expected to, that meant that Mitsotakis had a very strong hand, both within his party and as prime minister. It was his victory. So it's interesting to see that it wasn't just Syriza losing, but Syriza also giving him a push up.
So, given that background and given his personal victory, is he, you think, a different kind of leader from his predecessors for New Democracy? Presumably he has the scope for a greater personal impact because of his personal election victory. But if we begin to look at the governments now, then I wonder how distinctive he can actually be, how different.
He has been different already, in the sense that he came into power prepared. He'd done a lot of homework. This was unexpected. No, not unexpected. It was not the traditional way of seeing a party come into power.
Mm.
I'd been amazed in all my years of following them very closely how unprepared they were. It was as if they did nothing in opposition but think that they would just change drivers and they would steer the vehicle and it would go wherever they wanted to. So he's been different in that. He's different in that he was not a given to be the leader. He campaigned very hard and was very sort of dark horse is what you call it.
Yep.
When he won, which gave him credibility, which he wouldn't have had if he'd been given the leadership the way others had been given in the past, which is interesting, being part of a dynasty.
Okay. So he's hit the ground running, as we would say, and the summer was far more active than either domestic or external audiences would have expected. But I wonder if we come on to try to assess the governments already. If we simply focus on some of the most prominent headlines, what's the first headline? We've seen lots of controversy about the changes to the law about asylum and the universities and the protests, etc. Do you think that was the right kind of issue to choose at the beginning for the government to raise?
For him, absolutely. This is part of the answer to the first question, is why did Syriza lose?
Yes.
Syriza underestimated very much the sense of instability that was being created by this growing lawlessness. This sounds like a very conservative thing to say, but there was the sense that people were getting away with things that I, as a citizen, would not get away with if I did it, which counts very much in Greece. There's always a sense of injustice in the sense that why do I pay when others get away with it?
Yeah.
So when they would see that the kids who were throwing Molotov cocktails, or the more organized anti-establishment groups were acting as they wished without anybody pulling them into line, which was a feature of Greek politics and public life for a very long time, but it really got to large dimensions under Syriza and Syriza's tolerance for that. That angered a lot of people, and I think that is why, again, you got so many people who were of the age of 35 and upwards. They all voted, in that group, the majority voted for New Democracy, including the pensioners, including people you would have expected to be hoping that Syriza would carry on and not do what New Democracy might do to them. So this law and order thing was very big, and it's also a place where they can show that they can make a difference immediately, because anything that they do in terms of in terms of reforms will take a long time to come around. So it works in their favor that they play on that.
I can see that it could be a quick win, as it were, in those respects. But does it simply solidify a sense of tribalism, that by raising this issue, by pursuing it across all of the TV screens and the headlines, does it really make centrist voters more likely to cross over and support the party? If you're Mitsotakis trying to expand your coverage of the political spectrum, I wonder what it's doing for the centrist voters who otherwise might pinch their noses and vote for New Democracy.
I understand that the danger of that. It depends very much on how it's handled, and that things do not go really wrong. It's very dangerous and it's very sensitive, and in Greece we're very sensitive to people's rights and so on. In this sense, we might, be very unjust on one another in a million other ways. But no one wants to see violence from the state, and nobody wants to see violence against people who are in need, and so on. And I'm very aware of that, and it's one of the things I want to point out, is that it's all well and good to go for law and order, but you've also got to be very human about it. But there has to be law as well, which is something that has been very flexible in the past. So if they can maintain that balance between showing that there will be laws with the immigrant and refugee things, that is a very dangerous issue, but it's an issue that they have to deal with.
Okay.
And they are trying to ease the pressure there and trying to create a sense of controlling the situation, but they are not in control, because it's very big and it's very difficult and dangerous, and it was for the previous government, but more so for this one, because there's going to be a lot of reaction from local communities and so on, who don't want the consequences of easing the pressure on the islands, which is moving people, refugees and migrants elsewhere. So this is the thing that they are really worried about. The thing about the universities, if you'd like us to talk about, is different. I think people want to see order. They want to see people being able to go to the university and have open discussions, and students going and not having a problem with the factions that were in there. Okay,
but on this theme of whether New Democracy under Mitsotakis in power will be different, we'll come on to refugees and migration in a moment, but the news of last week, which got the international attention, was something which seemed to be a classic dysfunctionality of the system. At the last minute, the government pushed through Parliament a change to the provisions in terms of the penal code for money laundering. That is, those accused of corruption could retain their assets if the courts had not come to a conclusion within 18 months. Given the less than speedy system of the Greek courts, the expectation that the courts in any major corruption issue, as we've seen with Siemens, as we've seen with, I can not pronounce it, but Novartis or whatever, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, these things seem to take years. What kind of signal about newness is it on the part of the government if, in a kind of classic Greek parliamentary practice, at the last minute they change the money laundering schemes, seemingly to favour vested interests, friends, etc.? What wouldn't you expect from New Democracy in the past, other than something like that? So, is it doing the? Wasn't that a mistake, an indicator that perhaps they're not quite as new as we think they might be?
Who said they were new?
Okay, or different, or that it's a reversal to all politics, old style politics. It's not Kyriakos saying,
okay.
I'm new, I'm different, I'm a different kind of New Democracy leader.
Well, he does have to show that he's a New Democracy kind of leader, and he also has to live up to expectations that he's much better than the previous leaders of New Democracy, but also the previous governments that we've had in the last few years. So, having said that, I really don't know what possessed them to do that. I hope that if it is as scandalous as it appears, that they will answer for it. I don't know the subject well enough to really see their point. There are some stories that come across sometimes as very negative, but they have a positive impact. For example, there's a lot of the laws are very difficult in terms of responsibility of people in companies for taxes that were not paid, for example, by the company, even if they were not at the company or owned the company at the time.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Breaking away that.
I think one of the responses of the government spokesman was to say that the new law simply brings Greece in line with the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, that might or might not be the case, but it doesn't bring Greek law in line with British or I think German or possibly French law on these matters. So if you're trying to indicate to a domestic and international audience that we're going to be clean, liberal and different, this seems to be
definitely
an own goal.
At the same time, the competition authority did raid the banks suddenly. I don't know what came of it, but that was a surprise.
Yes.
As well. I don't know if the two are part of the same strategy, but that has to. The government, this government, if not this government, some government has to show that there will be the rule of law.
Okay.
But going back to your issue, I really think that was a mistake in terms of public relations, at least.
Okay.
What the essence of it is, I don't know.
Going back to your point about migration, I think today the Prime Minister has used the phrase that Greece is full and cannot take any more refugees. Other centre-right parties in Europe have used the migration issue, the refugee issue. I wonder if you think this is an issue that will play well for him and put the left in a very difficult position in terms of public opinion.
Or the other way around. The left, when we say the left, let's talk about Syriza, because there's nothing else really to... has presented him, this was their strategy before the elections, before the May elections and the July elections, was that he's far right and he's close to Orban and so on, which was not the case of being close to Orban. But they really did push the narrative that this was a far right group of people, and there are a lot of far right people in New Democracy. So this is not going to he's not giving anything that they haven't already taken, let's say, in
Yes.
presenting him as far right. I think what he's trying to do is control the far right within his party and outside of his party, because there's this little group called Greek Solution, Hellenic Observatory, which is it's one person shouting all the time, but this one person shouting can make a difference.
Yes.
To people who are susceptible to that rhetoric. So there is that problem of having to deal with the issue and dealing with it through trying to impose law and order on it makes you look very far right. If he's lucky, maybe it'll work out in a way. Maybe now that winter is coming, the flow of people will be smaller over the Aegean. Maybe that'll help. Maybe they will ease the pressure on the camps that they inherited. We've got to say that. And many thousands have come since then. So there are about 100,000 people in Greece right now, and the people on the islands are suffering from it. Not so much because of the migrants being there, but the tourism was down very much because people hear about this. So there is an irony there that the people who bore the brunt of dealing with the issue, and in a very humane way, over the long run, are being punished by tourists not going to their islands. So there is a lot to gain by establishing a sense of order there. But it's very risky. Some death, something going out of control is always very dangerous, which would make the government look very far right. But right now, I don't think they have an option other than to do that.
Okay, thanks. We looked at some of the particular short-term issues that the government has faced immediately in coming into power. I wonder if we could shift to the bigger picture about reform and whether Greece can reform. You're a highly respected voice in the Greek press. We read you for a number of years talking about the difficulties of reform under successive governments, and you've not been short in your criticism of different governments in bringing about real substantive reform in a more liberal direction. I wonder really whether the big picture is that an individual new prime minister coming to power might have a limited scope for reform, but that systemically there are deeper constraints on getting real reform. One of the questions very often raised, as you know far better than I, is the question of who actually wants reform beyond the blah blah. The question of a sense of vested interests or a sense of defensiveness in the face of reform which seems to come from a foreign European liberal agenda. So I wonder whether the change of government has made you much more optimistic, or whether actually what we're just seeing is a change of personnel here at the surface, but deeper down there are strong impediments, barriers to real reform. If you were talking to someone in Brussels, would you say that they should be optimistic about reform in the next 10 years, or we will just see a slight change of music?
Huge question. 200 years question. I was thinking about this conversation very intensively the last couple of weeks. And I've been all over the place in my answer. I was thinking of starting the answer with, the cliche, short question. The short answer is no. And the long answer is hell no. But I thought further, and I realized that if you look at it over the long run, Greece is reforming all the time. And it's gaining all the time. And it's actually in a very good position. The fact that it's not in as good a position as it could be is because we make things difficult for ourselves all the time. There is never a choice that is clear-cut. Things are never exactly what they seem. This may sound a bit abstract, but I'll get to what I want to say. When we've seen reform, it's usually come after a disaster. And very often it has come through Greece being in such a terrible state that foreigners have had to step in for one or other reason. If we go back to 120 years ago to 1898, it's very interesting that in the previous year, the Greeks got involved in a disastrous war with the Turks. The passions led to this, and it was really terrible. They were fortunate not to lose territory, but they had to pay a huge price for that in terms of money. So they had to take out a huge loan, which they got from foreigners. The foreigners, because they gave them the loan, wanted to have a say in how it would be used. What's interesting about this is that whereas in the beginning the Greeks were fully aware of their own responsibility for this war, this narrative began, which was the foreigners made us get involved in the war so that they would lose, so they would lend us money and then they would step in and take control of us. So that was the good old populist argument that we've seen transferred over the generations.
We are the victims.
To today. We are the victims. First of all, as in this crisis, we all remember very closely, and all of us who were involved in following it. And in the beginning, there was this general sense of, wow, we really screwed up. We to blame for this. What are we going to do? And there was an acceptance of the need for reform. And then gradually we got back to the narrative that the Germans made us do it, made it happen, so that they could take control of our gas and so on and all that. I go back to 1898 and this foreign supervision. That foreign supervision imposed reforms on Greece. Those reforms helped Greece get to the point where they could fight the Balkan Wars very successfully and expand and expand and expand before they made the big mistake again in 1922, overstepping their powers in Asia Minor.
Again with an international rescue.
Again with an international rescue. Then there was the fact of later going into the gold standard, which meant that they had to create a central bank, and then you had a central bank which has played an incredibly important role in the time since then. So you've got this machinery of history churning away, and we Greeks doing everything we can to make it difficult, but somehow things are moving along. And in the last few years, though we talk about all the mistakes that we've made, there are the institutions in place and a lot more reforms than we give credit to, because first, they haven't been implemented. Second, they haven't come to fruition, many of the changes that have been made, and we see the problems more than we see what's happening. But we'll also get to a point where we'll fall back on those institutions. We talk about transparency, and there is a mechanism for transparency in place. We've got to make it work. We've got to implement it. For example, we talk about public procurements and the corruption that appeared there before. Everything now has to go onto the website of the Avia, which means transparency, and people can keep tabs on those things there. There are always these corners of, I'm sorry, I should turn around a little bit. There are all these corners of corruption that are always there, and they're always making things difficult. And this is part of the problem with Greece, is that the laws are so complicated, the procedures are so complicated, there are so many vested interests looking after their own little corner, that you kind of get the sense that there is a design in this. And I think that people who study artificial intelligence should really make a close mega-data study of the Greek public sector and how it is incredibly capable of obstructing everything, even things that it cannot foresee. But it's impossible to solve.
This is your optimistic argument.
This is my optimistic argument, absolutely. But it's incapable of actually reaching the point of solving problems, of breaking through the... It's like having a machine that tightens the Gordian knot all the time, but tirelessly. So you've got these people trying to chip away at that. Those things are still there. So what I'm saying is the institutions are there. We might undermine them a lot, and in the past we haven't seen them strengthened, but they are there. So when people get to the point of saying we want those institutions to work, they will be there. It's not as bad as it could have been. We're not outside of the Eurozone. There's that. Let's not even talk about the recovery that we might be witnessing now, because that's all very fragile. But I'm thinking of the bigger picture of whether Greece can reform. It's never going to be Greece is reformed. Everything is working.
Yeah.
But it is that at least there is the framework and the machinery coming into place there. And I see the younger people are much more rational than my generation and the older ones, much more involved in following the situation, much more critical of all the base things that we see in Greece. I'm very optimistic about them, and this comes at a time where they should have no hope, because the situation is desperate for young people. The basic salary is 650 euros. If you put taxes and social security on that, they're taking home 420 euros a month. What future can they look forward to? If you see the demographics that we expect the population to plummet. The study came out recently that shows that of the 1.5 million students in university, that in 2035 there will be 1.1. There will be a 30% drop in people of student age in that period, which means the question, who's going to be working for the pensioners, who are one of the highest levels of pensioners in the world. Right now we're 8th in the world in terms of people aged over 60, and as time goes on, we're going to go higher up. In 2050 we'll be 4th. The 40-something% of people in Greece in 2050 will be 60 and over, which means that people who are now working at these salary levels have to think of supporting people at that time, which is probably going to be us and our children, if not our grandchildren, and having families and running a country. That is not looking very, very positive. So it's good to see that there is an anger already there, and it's also interesting to see that the young people who've left Greece in the last decade, they're very present in the debate and in the whole story. And I hope they remain present, because they will make a big difference.
So you think in terms of reform, there's a change, younger people are expecting real reform in the system, etc. But I wonder, at the time of the next election, when Kyriakos Mitsotakis faces re-election, what the basis of the assessments of the public will be, whether it will be sufficient to have a better growth rate than in the past, or will they actually be looking for institutional reform, a public administration that works, universities that are attractive to students to stay home rather than come to the LSE or whatever? I wonder whether you think the impact of the crisis has been to change the basis of how voters might assess the government in the future.
I think voters will be much stricter. Voters have always, they go where their self-interest is. Very often we see it's narrow self-interest. If you're a pensioner, you worry about your pension. If you're unemployed, you'll worry about that. And it's very natural. But you have to have your options as well. It's tragic that you have parties that will be focusing only on that need, on that insecurity, on that prejudice, to go into other issues. But you need parties that are going to be looking to creating the future. So I think that the people the younger people will want to see that. If this government wants to succeed, it will have to look like it is much better than previous ones in terms of fairness, in terms of putting the country's interests first. And I say that not because of this government, but because of any government. We have the possibility of seeing that. At present, because of this perennial high temperature in politics, we're seeing the black and white all the time playing. I would like to see closer cooperation between the government and the opposition. I think it would benefit both of them. Right now, they always think that that is going to be against their interests. But people do need to see a solution coming.
And you think that kind of crossover would be feasible?
It wouldn't be a crossover that would make them the same. They're not the same. They come from different backgrounds, and they have to be different, and their visions are different. But there has to be a sense that we are not at war with each other all the time. I say that when we've had 7 wars and civil wars in 200 years, but I just do expect that people want something better now.
Okay.
So if this government shows that it is aware at least of the fact that it governs everybody, which it says it does, but it has to show it right through its term, that will be in its favor.
A Greek academic friend said to me last week, at the height of the crisis, I'd regularly read Kathimerini to find out what's going on. In 2015, it allowed me to understand what was going on beyond the rhetoric of the government. Today, I've stopped reading Kathimerini because I have a sense of political bias. They're not actually telling us stories which are negative for the government. The news reporting has become more biased. Is that a unfair criticism of the newspaper?
Difficult to say, because I don't know what he might be.
She.
Or she. Give myself away with that, sorry. I don't know why I thought it would be a he. Because I pictured who it might be. I think that shows more of the tensions that are at play. I read the comments, the analyses in there, and I see a lot of criticism of things, and but let's put it in the way that it's sort of couched in the way the government should be careful not to do something. The government should be careful not to overstep the mark of being too strong, or in dealing with this or that. There was huge pushback when there was this discussion about naming a metro station after Pavlos Bakoyannis. So you saw that in there as well. But it's kind of natural in the first 100 days to show some goodwill towards a new government that they did. I mean, Kathimerini was in favor of reform always. And this is one of the interesting things, if I may speak a little personally over this. When I joined Kathimerini in 1998, we were very in favor of the Sumeet government, which was a PASOK government, because it was the government that was pushing for reform. In 2001, when the pension reform that the Sumeet government pushed was defeated by the PASOK party itself, basically, Kathimerini turned, not because it turned against Semitis, but because it wanted the reform, and it expected Karamanlis to bring that reform. Kostas Karamanlis, when he wasn't bringing the reform, Kathimerini was very critical of him. So my answer to your academic friend is that there is this movement in that direction always. Pro-Europe, pro-reform, pro-NATO, pro-good relations with America, pro-common sense approach to things. And the Mitsotakis government has, even before elected, was showing that it was in that line. So that's natural. I am sure that there will be criticism when criticism is due.
Thank you. We've covered many topics. We've tried to cover the full gamut of, I think we started in 1898 actually, to the present day.